Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the webinar, Protecting Vendor Bank Details When Changes Are Received via Email, Beyond the Phone Call. It is brought to you today by Debra Richardson, LLC, in partnership with the Authoriti Network, Inc. Before we begin, some housekeeping items. This session is being recorded. We will send you a link to the recording within 3 days. Feel free to submit your questions anytime. We will save it for the Q&A session during the last 15 minutes. If we don't get to all of your questions during the Q&A session, additional questions can be asked and answered via email. Please also download the handouts, a PDF of this presentation, along with an authentication reference template, as well as a vendor payments brochure from Authoriti. We have 2 speakers today, and I first want to introduce myself. I am Debra Richardson, and you may have heard of me by my saying, putting the AP in happy. As a previous AP senior manager, managing a team of 17, processing over 2,000 vendor requests per month, I now work with AP vendor teams that are still fully or partially manual to add authentication techniques, internal controls, and best practices. I have the only site that is dedicated to the vendor setup and maintenance process, where I have some free resources and tools, including a blog and a podcast, both known for providing actionable steps like you will see in this webinar to help you and your vendor maintenance team with vendor maintenance issues. The second speaker today is Paul Alexander from Authoriti. Paul, you want to take it away with an intro?
Yes, good morning. Thank you, Debra. Very pleased to be here with you today. I'm a global head of sales at Authoriti. I have a 30-year record and experience in multiple startups, as well as large corporations like Oracle, Dell, and Brocade. And we want to talk to you today about our solution that we've taken from what we built for the financial sector, namely banks for protecting high-value wire transfers, ACHs, and allowing them to not only identify that it's their customer, but also to validate the details of the financial instruction, right? Online, when folks are not able to be face-to-face, or you don't have the time constraint to call the person back and validate everything. So we borrow those elements, and we're applying that to a solution to allow you to validate an invoice from a vendor or a change request for payment information from a vendor in a very easy and seamless way. So hope you all enjoy it.
All right, thanks, Paul. So let's take a look at the agenda. We will first look at fraud in vendor banking changes. Then we'll talk about authenticating vendor bank change requests. And then I will provide some automation options for authentication and bank validation. I will then turn it over to Paul, who will talk about the Authoriti Networks, Inc., and provide a demo of their permission code technology, and then we will wrap up with a Q&A session. But first, we're going to start with our first poll question, and let me get that. Okay, and so the first poll question is, what do you currently require before updating existing vendor bank details? A, bank details on bank or vendor letterhead. B, voided check. C, phone call to the vendor, D, 2 or more of the above, or E, none of the above. So we've got folks answering, and it looks like we have most are doing 2 or more of the above. We've got a small few that are only doing the phone call to the vendor, and then we do have some that have none of the above. So this should be a very informative webinar for you. So let's close that. All right. So first, we're going to talk about fraud in vendor bank changes. All right, so looking at the US first, this US map and the stats are taken from the FBI 2019 report of IC3 complaints. The total complaints for the year averages to 1,300 per day. Now, business email compromise scams, where a fraudster attempts to trick APT members into believing they are a CEO, CFO, or a vendor to change vendor bank details to divert payments, that resulted in more than $1.7 billion in losses. Now, BEC scams, also called CEO fraud or any other name that results in changing a vendor's banking to a fraudulent account, they typically involve a criminal spoofing or mimicking a legitimate email address. For example, an APT member will receive a message that appears to be from an executive within their company or a vendor to which the company has a relationship. The email will then request a vendor banking change, sometimes a wire transfer, or even a gift card purchase that sometimes seems legitimate, but actually funnels money directly to a criminal. And this is a global issue. The International Criminal Police Organization, or Interpol, is an intergovernmental organization with 194 member countries. And in October 2019, they launched a public awareness campaign for business email compromise with the hashtag #BeCareful. The key here for global fraud is to be proactive in implementing authentication techniques, internal controls, and best practices. No APT member can be 100% all day, every day to spot these fraudulent emails. Plus, if you are like 42% of US companies and had a large number of vendor payments by check, you are reaching out to those vendors and expecting an increased number of bank changes to be received via email. And the cyber criminals know this. Think.Digital partners have reported that hackers attacked world businesses 22 million times between April 13th and April 19th. So cyber criminals, not surprisingly, are trying to capitalize on this moment. So let's talk about my proprietary authentication, validation, management process that I use for my clients that still have manual or fully manual vendor processes to ensure that real vendors are added to the vendor master file, and then also avoid both fraud and regulatory fines. So the first step that we'll talk about today is authentication, which is the confirmation of the vendor data source or delivery method of the vendor documentation. So the data source is who is sending, The delivery method can be email or vendor portal or fax or even hard copy. So if you have a vendor self-registration portal, you would rely on the delivery method to confirm, since the login requirement in the portal authenticates the data source. For this webinar, however, since we're focusing on the email delivery method, we're going to be authenticating using the data source or who is sending the email. So step 2 is validation, where you validate vendor data before it is entered into your ERP. And to help with this, I do have a free vendor, or I do have a free download. It's a vendor validation reference list with resource links, which identifies not only resources to verify a vendor is real and not on any watch list, but it is also divided based on the type of information being validated and on which vendor document you'll find it, such as the invoice or the contract. Now, the third step is management, where you revalidate or inactivate existing vendors in your vendor master file on a consistent basis. So inactivating those vendors you haven't done business with in 15, 18, or 24 months, then checking for duplicate vendors and revalidating active vendor data to make sure there are no changes and making sure that they have not been added to a watch list since you originally set them up or modified them last. Now, I have another free webinar on this topic next Wednesday, and it's called 8 Steps to Clean Your Vendor Master File When You're Doing It Manually. So please make sure you register if you would like to review steps and best practices. Now, finally, I also have an e-guide that contains these steps. It's called the 3-Step Vendor Setup and Maintenance Process e-guide. And it does contain 5 authentication techniques, 12 internal controls, and over 13 best practices. And I will have a special offer at the end of this webinar if you would like to purchase. So now let's dive into authentication and how you can add confirmation of the vendor data source for requests coming through email. So we're going to start by reviewing a typical current process. So keep in mind that you may have more or less than the steps I have identified here. So the first step is that you're going to receive the request to update the vendor's bank details via email. Now, you'll probably be eyeballing the email address or other parts of the email to ensure that it's not fraudulent, even though you know that fraudsters can hack you or your vendor's emails to make it look like a legitimate email. Next, you're going to send a branded ACH form if you require a form. If you don't, you may just send instructions. You may require and receive a voided check and or banking information on bank or company letterhead. Next, you're going to receive that information back, either the completed branded ACH form and or your required documents. Next, you're going to search for the vendor in your accounting system or ERP, and you'll do that by searching by name, address, and tax ID, so you can make sure you have the right vendor, especially in systems like SAP, where there can be multiple remit vendors with different payment details, so you want to make sure you have the right one. The next step is you're going to review the vendor record against what was submitted, because you want to make sure it is a change of banking or that it has not already been updated, because just like vendors send duplicate invoices, they can sometimes send duplicate requests for changes. The next thing you're going to do is verify data such as the routing number or the legal name and tax ID. So you would verify like the legal name and tax ID with the IRS or the legal name with OFAC to make sure they did not get on any watch list. We would also verify the routing number to make sure it's valid for an ACH or wire payment, since depending on the bank, it can be different. And then the next step, this is where you make that phone call. You contact the vendor by phone, of course, not using what's in the email, but what is on the vendor record, or if it's not there, what's on the vendor's website or on a valid processed invoice. Now, this phone, while an effective manual process, can be very time consuming. Even before the pandemic, in my experience, it often took several calls to reach the vendor or to get a call back. Now, the last step is to, of course, update the vendor record. So you're going to end the process by updating the vendor record. Now, these 8 steps, there's nothing inherently wrong. Prior to a few years ago, before fraud started to increase, it worked fine. Many of us even added the phone call in recent years to combat increased fraud. But in today's world, especially during these unprecedented times, that phone call is no longer enough. And here's the problem with it. So relying solely on confirming banking updates with the vendor overlooks the time it takes to get that far. And here you can see we have 6 steps. So it overlooks those six steps only to discover that they may be or are fraudulent requests. Also, by that time, you may have already disclosed vendor information to the fraudster. And here's an example. So last year, I answered one question on a forum where the AP manager wanted to know what everyone else did because fraudsters were contacting the AP manager's team by email or phone, asking for vendor balances and when they were scheduled to be paid. The problem was when they found a vendor with a large balance to be paid soon, the fraudsters would send a request to change that vendor's banking. Well, the AP manager thought because they had that confirmation phone call, it would prevent fraudulent payments. And that may be true, but how much labor is that costing the AP manager staff? Especially now since both AP and the vendors may be using their personal phones, and now neither really recognizes the phone number that's being called. So let's look at adding authentication to this process step by step. So this is what you need to do first in step 1 when you receive your request to update banking details. You need to authenticate the requester, whether they are a vendor or an employee submitting documents on behalf of the vendor, before providing instructions or your branded ACH form. And you can do that by asking 2 or 3 identifying questions. And this process should sound familiar to you since, when you call your bank, for example, they put you through the same round of questions to make sure that you are who you say you are before they or you start making changes or get information on your account. And so what I'm showing here is the authentication reference template, and it is included as a download in the handouts. Now, looking at the vendor side, you want to request confirmation of 2 to 3 validations that only the vendor or employees of the vendor would know. You do want to have 4 or 5 to choose from so that the same questions are not asked each time. Another critical key, which you'll see divided here between invoicing, purchasing, and vendor file, is that you want to make sure you're not asking for the same elements on the same document. So, for example, you do not want to ask for an invoice number and an invoice date, since that information is on the same document. Better is to ask for an invoice number and the last 4 digits of the tax ID, or for a valid purchase order number and the last 4 digits of the existing bank. You may be asking, well, what if the vendor pushes back because they do not have the correct information? And that can happen. But what I would ask you to think about is, if you are dealing with a vendor employee that does not have the correct information to answer those questions, then why is that vendor employee requesting a change in the first place? Do you really want to make a change to a vendor's existing bank account if the request comes from a vendor's employee that does not have the capability to access the existing banking information? You must wonder if they really have the authority to make the change, or if they are who they say they are. So moving on to internal employees, and yes, you may need to authenticate employees if your email system does not flag emails as external. And to do that, it's kind of the same process. You want to request confirmation of 2 to 3 validations that only the employee would know and that you or your team has access to. So for example, you can use their next level up and their cubicle number. Now, the request to update the bank details could stop right here. If the vendor or the employee calling in or emailing in on behalf of the vendor does not answer these correctly, you could stop the request right there, saving your staff time at least 5 steps, and the vendor, also saving the actual vendor, another phone call. Of course, now that they may not be able to receive anyway. One thing about this authentication template, once you download it, it does work for phone calls too. So you can use that as part of, to create a script. So as part of my vendor process redesign for Cabarrus County, I created scripts for the help desk for both vendor and employee inquiries, and that was by phone and also by email. Another thing to keep in mind is that you want to complete for your company based on your business processes, leadership, industry requirements. I do have some suggestions here, but feel free to overwrite those, and then also remember to get leadership, auditors, their approval before implementing. All right, so that was step 1. So once they successfully authenticate, you are going to send them the branded ACH form. Only this time, you're going to require authentication on the form. So I recommend that you have, as required, the existing bank details or the last 3 payments, their deposit dates and amounts. I also recommend that you require their full tax ID. And then if you have any company, any unique element that is special for your company, then you can add that as a requirement as well. Now, optional but still recommended is the remit address. Some accounting systems like PeopleSoft have multiple payment locations tied to separate remit addresses, and having it on the form ensures you're updating the right location. I also recommend that you have on there the vendor ID, which can help know the right vendor ID to update. for those systems like SAP, where you can have more than one vendor ID for the same tax ID. And again, you can have as optional any unique company element that you have. Now, I do want to talk about a couple of best practices for this branded ACH form. For those of you that may want to implement one if you don't currently have it, or if you do have it and don't have these best practices, you do want to change it every year. And then you also do not want to post it on your company website. And I do have a toolkit that contains not only the e-guide, but also templates for vendor setup forms, desktop procedures, and vendor communications. It does include a template branded ACH form with fillable fields for your vendor to populate the existing bank details and the full tax ID. And just like the e-guide, I will have a special offer for purchasing at the end of the webinar. All right, so step 3, we're not going to really have any changes in that step, nor are we going to have any changes for searching for the vendor in the accounting system, although if you require the vendor ID or remit address, it may make it easier. We do have a change here, though, for step 5, reviewing the vendor record, because now you want to add reviewing the you want to review the banking form to authenticate by making sure the items you requested matches the vendor record. So you want to make sure that the information for the existing bank details or last 3 deposit dates and deposit amounts and dates match either the vendor record or your invoice module. And then the same thing with the tax ID, and then with any unique company element you may have included. All right, so moving on, step 6, really no changes with verifying the data, routing number, legal name, and tax ID. Step 7, confirm with the vendor the bank change by phone. Really no change with that. You do want to utilize a best practice of confirm using the contact information on the vendor record, not what's in the email. And then you want to document on a log. And this is another best practice. So you want to document the day, the date, the time, the phone number called, the source of the phone number, the team member that called, and then what happened. And this comes in handy to track pending confirmations. It can also be added to the vendor record as comments, but there's no way to pull, there may not be a way to pull to track pending confirmations. So I do recommend that you start this log. This way, if something happens to the original employee that called, someone will know where to start to continue the process. And then management can also monitor this log to make sure that pending confirmations, those vendors that you called but didn't get an answer, to make sure that they're being followed up on so the requests are not aging and increasing your turnaround time. Now, I do want to bring up just a notion here of whether or not, we can replace step 7, that confirming with the vendor via a phone call, with notify. And let me talk about that in this next screen. So step 8 is update the vendor record. Really no changes there, but you do see a star, and I have added a step 9 to send a notification to the vendor. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with my blogs, but this was actually my first blog that I wrote back in October of 2018. And a best practice, the same way that your bank or PayPal or Amazon or Netflix sends you a notification email that information on your account has been changed, and if you did not initiate the change, to take some action like contacting them or changing all your passwords. You can do the same thing with your vendors. Now, it can be an automated process, so if you would like to do this, think about putting it in front of your IT team. When I was an AP practitioner, we were able to automate it in SAP, but in PeopleSoft, we had to send manual letters. But this process, whether it's manual or not, was still a less labor-intensive effort because it did not depend on catching and speaking to your vendor and, of course, then keeping track of pending confirmations. So, my question is, can it replace the phone call? If you have authenticated the vendor or the employee that's sending the change request, and if you have authenticated the data and you are sending a notification after the change, do you really need that vendor phone call that we know is time consuming for team members and their supervisors or managers? So let's look at what the revised process would be, adding authentication and replacing that phone call. So this is the revised process. Step 1, we're going to receive the request to update banking details, but this time we're going to authenticate the vendor and the employee by asking authentication questions. We are still going to send the branded ACH form, but this time we're going to require authenticating data on that branded ACH form. Then we're going to receive that branded ACH form back. We're going to search for the vendor in the accounting system. We're going to review the vendor record. This time, though, we're going to verify whatever that authenticating data was, verify that it matches. And then we're going to also, again, verify the data, such as a routing number, legal name, tax ID. And then step 7, now, instead of that confirmation call to the vendor, we're going to replace that with updating the vendor record. And we have added or changed step 8 to be send a notification email to the vendor. So same 8 steps, but we've eliminated the phone call and replaced it with a notification. Okay. So now we're at our second poll question. And that is, how likely are you to add authentication to your current process? Very likely, likely, maybe, I don't know yet, or not likely at all. So we do have a very large volume saying very likely. Looks like just over half. All right, so with that, I'm going to go ahead and close, and we are going to move to our next section, which is authentication options, and these are tools and options available. Okay, so the authentication options work either by authenticating the vendor or employee or the bank details. And so for the pre-note, many of you may already be doing this, but not all banks return the bank account holder name, so you may not know if it's truly your vendor's bank account, even if it is an active account. The next one, early warning and GIAC. Now these provide bank account ownership, And it's based on a large database that is populated by US banks voluntarily contributing their data. The issue is that coverage can be low in areas where there are smaller banks or credit unions that don't have the staff to submit the data. Also, monthly fees can be costly, and since it only includes participating banks in the US, no vendors with international bank accounts can be authenticated. Now, we're going to skip over to the vendor portal, where the vendor portal will authenticate the vendor and or employee, and some may even be able to validate banking details using similar options that you would use manually. Or maybe you have an e-invoicing portal where you can have the vendor upload their banking details securely. Or maybe you're thinking about implementing a full-on vendor self-registration portal. The issues there is that the implementation time can be extended, and once it's implemented, vendor adoption can be an issue. But there is good news, because there is another option. Now I will turn it over to Paul Alexander, who will explain Authoriti's permission code platform that can validate both invoices and bank change requests.
Thank you, Debra. Let me share my screen. Everyone should see the title page. All right, we good to go then, Debra?
Yes, we're good to go, Paul.
Fantastic. So I want to now show you how Authoriti can enhance the process that Debra just went over with you, right? Using technology to help you perform the vendor authentication and the validation of key data elements, such as a change request to how the vendor wants to get paid, or to validate the authenticity of an actual invoice. And this is combining the technology with Debra's process is a great set of tools for you to stop fraud. So Authoriti has come to this scenario from trying to solve and assist customers to increase the security model and add additional layers beyond basic authentication, right? We're all familiar with the challenge and response model. Like, who are you? What can you prove for me to let you get in? And an institution has to really find the balance between how much friction, i.e. how hard are they going to make it for their customers to get in, or versus how much fraud they're willing to put up with, right? And then the last real takeaway here is that the institution's responsible for getting things right. And if they don't get it right, they're financially responsible for the fraud. And for the scenario with accounts payable, the actual fraud is coming from outside of your organization. You can put up big walls and robust IT security, but the problem isn't starting inside of your domain. It's coming from outside to you. So our platform is built upon the permission code platform. It's a multi-factor idea. Think of it as a smart pin that doesn't just identify you, but the pin now also contains verifiable data about the transaction. How much is the transaction? What is it? Who's it for? What data is it good for? And a number of other data elements. It's all configurable. The key point here is that each of these permission codes are tamper-proof, and they can be distributed via a number of different channels, whether you want to receive them via email, via a piece of paper on a fax, or have someone even read it to you over the phone. The key takeaway is that it gives you a way to validate another form of another document that's independent of the permission code. So one of the things that's interesting about our permission code model is that the PINs are definitive. They are specifically tied to a user or vendor for a specific transaction. And there's no guessing about, does this match what looks like fraud? It is basically telling you this transaction can be verified and you can validate any detail of this transaction. So as opposed to guessing that we're hitting 98% rate of catching everything, we're actually showing you one-to-one connection that something is safe for you to execute on. So moving into the topic today, vendor payments fraud. I think we're all well familiar with BEC. Debra gave you an overview of it. The bottom line is the bad guys are trying to submit to you either a flat out phony invoice, or they're trying to convince you that they're one of your vendors and they're going to change how that vendor is getting paid, where they're getting paid. And it's a combination of social engineering and a bit of trickery to put it on the accounts payable teams to get it right. So our solution, just very simplistically, it allows you to add a process that augments your manual process so that you can have a direct connection to your vendors, so that your organization can simply validate that the changes are authentic, to validate that the invoice is untampered, and giving you trust into that transaction. So when you take a look at the flow, right, a vendor is onboarded onto the platform. You simply send them an invitation code from our solution that associates them to you, right? And it enables them now to generate what we call a permission code for any time that they want to submit to you a change request or an invoice. And the flow is very simple. The vendor is seamlessly going to submit an invoice the way they normally do, attach a permission code to it, you receive it, you simply do a quick validation, and if it all checks out, there's no need for further action, no need for callbacks. You can simply go ahead and pay that or process that change request, right? So once a vendor is onboarded and they're ready to invoice you, let's go through the workflow for a vendor to generate a permission code for an invoice that's going to include a payment change request. And then once that is generated and transmitted, the accounts payable team is going to go and validate that invoice. So here's our portal. On the left side is the accounts payable portal where you enter in all the relevant details for a transaction, and this is configurable. Today's model has a few baked-in assumptions. And on the right is the Authoriti app that the vendor is going to use. And I have a few different scenarios loaded up today, but we're going to focus in here on the payments e-remittance, which is specific to how a vendor would come and use the system once they've actually generated an invoice in their accounting system. So I'm going to go in and the vendor is going to select their vendor ID. I have a few examples in here. So we're going to be vendor 3333. And now the vendor simply looks at his invoice that it created and he copies over the 9-digit ABA routing number, also the account number and the amount. This could also include a invoice ID, a transaction ID, a purchase order, or if in an international basis, it could be a SWIFT IBAN code, right, to be included in this. So now the vendor simply generates this this permission code, and that number that's present is what they copy down and supply to you with their normal invoice. They could simply write it on the invoice. So now they've transmitted the invoice over to you, you've received it, and you need to validate this. So you start by simply going in, typing in the vendor number, typing in the permission code that you received for this transaction, and then the rest of the information that you're going to validate. In this case, you are validating some new payment instructions for this vendor with a new account number and the amount for that invoice. And again, as I said, these fields are customizable. We can tweak these to your needs. And before we validate, let's go and change the vendor ID and see what happens. You can see right away that we get an invalid account ID number because this permission code that's being checked was not generated by that ID. So we set it back to the correct vendor ID. And what if we changed a routing number or a bank account number or dollar amount? And you'll see that it's not going to pass for that purpose, right? So let's put all the data back to what it's supposed to be. And now we're going to go and validate it. And you see, you get back an immediate response saying, this is valid. But what if somebody decides to use the permission code twice? We're going to change the dollar amount and try to run it again. And what you see here is that each permission code can only be used one time, right? That is something that is our default. And there are scenarios where we allow you to use them more than one time. But the key here is that you now have something that you can control and you can validate and you can get absolute certainty about a transaction. So let me jump out of the demo now and kind of go close out here. So the solution that I just showed to you is completely standalone. You can implement this tomorrow. All you need to do is have your vendors on board and have them go and download the Authoriti mobile application from the Google Store or the iOS Store. Doesn't really require any integration. Now, we can integrate if you had a online intake form for your invoices. That would just be some simple code to call our APIs for validation. But the simple manual process allows you to get protected right now, and it allows you to secure the process and add additional capability to your teams, and gives you the ability to validate invoices, validate transactions, and start doing it right away in the most simple way possible. All right, thank you all. Debra, over to you.
All right, thanks, Paul. So let me take that back. Let's go through that. Okay, so thanks, Paul, for that demo. So now I just want to quickly show you what a revised process would be like if you included Authoriti's permission code technology. In other words, if we automate that authentication process, because I do realize that, you know, in a manual process, adding an additional step or two or requiring additional information does take additional time. Although if you're manual, there's not a lot you can do about it. And it's valuable if you are still manual. But if you can add in some automation where you can, why not? So let's take a look at what it would look like adding this authentication permission code technology to the manual process. So step one is you would receive, as normal, the request to update the banking details. Only this time, it arrives with the permission code and the updated banking details. So you don't have to send or wait for the branded ACH form to come back. Okay. Then, of course, you would search for the vendor in the accounting system or ERP. Then you would review the vendor record to verify it's a change of banking. You would verify data such as the routing number, legal name. That step remains the same. You would then update the vendor record, and then, of course, sending a notification email. So in this case, you are down to 6 steps by adding in Authoriti's permission code technology. Okay. So now we're at the third poll question. Let me get that opened up. Okay, so how likely are you to add automated authentication to your current process? Very likely, likely, maybe, don't know yet, or not likely at all. Okay, they're still coming in. So looks like we've got quite a few with very likely. We do have some that don't know yet, and that's perfectly fair. So let's go ahead. All right, so we're going to go ahead and close this. All right, so I do want to let you know, I talked about a special deal. So with my vendor team resources here, you can see that on the left-hand side here, there are quite a few free resources available on my website. The vendor validation reference list I talked about earlier. There's also a desktop procedure template if you want to document this process. I also have a W-8 expiration date tracking form for those W-8s that expire December 30th of that third year. And then, of course, I talked about the 8 steps to clean your vendor master file when you're doing it manually. The e-guide and the toolkit, you do have I am offering a 25% off discount using discount code webinar25, and you can use that through 11:59 p.m. May 6th. So again, plenty of free resources, a discount on paid resources, and all are immediate downloads. And then if you'd like to talk about your process and where you may need some help, I do offer free consultations as well. And then I also have information here to connect with me, LinkedIn, Twitter, and then also a link to my podcast, Putting the AP in Happy. Okay, so we are at the Q&A session. We will get through as many as we can. If your question is not answered, please feel free to reach out to me at info@debrarrichardson.com or to Paul at info@authoriti.net. So let's check here. All right, so we do have a question here, and this is actually a very valid question. What if the employees or the vendor pushes back? And the answer I would say to that is, even with internal stakeholders, with employees, they just don't understand why we ask for what we ask for or why we do what we do. I have heard so many times before, something like, it's just a simple name change. And it's really not a simple name change, right? So what I would say, whether you're doing it for this vendor banking detail update issue, or just your vendor onboarding and change process overall, is you need to document. So one, it makes it an auditable process. I'm not sure how many of you out there have your vendor process audited, but it makes it an auditable process. Also, you make sure the process is documented. And again, if you need that desktop procedure template, you can go to my website and download a free one. That link is included in the presentation. But you document your internal processes, and it will be for your vendor team to know how to process requests that come in. And again, it makes it auditable. Now, for your vendors, I would, and also your internal stakeholders, I would also document, and that means creating a vendor setup and maintenance policy, or add it or add a section in your accounts payable policy for vendor setup and maintenance processes. And so when you have pushback from a vendor or an internal employee, you can reference the vendor policy that leadership has signed off on. So what that means is that now you'll have a revised process with authentication to reduce fraud, and a desktop procedure for internal, the internal vendor team to follow, and then of course the policy that tells vendors and your internal stakeholders and employees how to do business with you. So you'll have the desktop procedure for your vendor team to know what they need to do, and it's auditable. And then you'll have the vendor policy for internal stakeholders and your vendors that tell them how to do business with you. So if you get pushback from anyone, you have documented processes and a policy to combat that. Okay. All right, so let's check the next one. So Paul, this is one for you, and they're asking about do they have to implement with all vendors, or can they just kind of identify like the most the highest risk vendors and just use the product for those vendors?
Yeah, Debra, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Fantastic. So that's a great question. So this comes up a lot, right? So what we're finding is that there are vendors that you do business with that are at the most high risk for being compromised, right? Where they don't have dedicated IT and IT security. So they're absolutely the ones you should prioritize, as opposed to, let's say, a national vendor like Verizon that's supplying you with wireless capabilities, or Comcast that's providing you internet, and they're doing, they're sending you a ERP output from their solution directly to you, right? So they're probably not a good candidate to use this additional system to secure the transaction on the invoice, right? And as you saw on the screen, right, a lot of the fields can be customized and tweaked to make it as relevant as possible to your existing process. But it's not a one size fits all, right? You might roll this out for one set of vendors that provide you with certain elements, and you might even roll it out to another set of vendors who only see certain choices in the way that they're able to generate things. So lots of flexibility, right? And lots of ability on our side to tailor this to the audience.
Thanks, Paul. And I'd actually like to add something to that as well. So last year, there was a press release that came out where Cabarrus County had originally paid $2.5 million to one of their large construction vendors. I think they got like $700,000 back. So it was like a net, they were able to recover that back. So it was like a net $1.7 million that was lost. But that was a vendor that was, a large project vendor that, had they implemented something like, or had they implemented the Authoriti code, Authoriti permission code technology, they could have just set it up for that vendor, and then any vendors that had, large payments that would be made to them, and that would have prevented that fraudulent payment from going out. And I did work with them, and I put in the authentication process that we just went over today. So that will or should prevent them from having making additional fraudulent payments, but automating that process using the permission code technology would be helpful for them, as well as anyone else that wants to automate that process. Okay. So I think we're at about a minute beforehand, so we're going to go ahead and let you guys know that if you have any additional questions, if we didn't get to your question, or if you think about a question afterwards, again, feel free to email us at the email addresses on the screen. Don't forget to download the handouts, and thank you very much for attending. This webinar is now ending.